Greetings, Starfighter. You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada. The Last Starfighter wasn't just another 1,980-second sci-fi adventure. It was the first Hollywood film to gamble its future on computer-generated imagery. Forget matte paintings and miniature models, this was digital space battles rendered by bleeding-edge technology that barely existed. Behind the neon glow and arcade dream story lurked chaos. Supercomputers overheating, render farms failing, entire sequences redone at the last minute. Cast and crew doubted the film would even be finished, let alone remembered. Today, we're unlocking 20 weird facts about The Last Starfighter that reveal how a cult classic reshaped the future of cinema. Stay tuned for a bonus fact so wild it sounds like sci-fi itself. Ready? Strap in. Let's fire up the Gunstar and dive in. The first fully CGI space battles before The Last Starfighter. Sci-Fi relied on physical miniatures, from Star Wars' X-Wings to Star Trek's Enterprise models. But director Nick Castle and producer Gary Adelson wanted something no one had dared. Entire battle sequences done with computers. They turned to Digital Productions, a company run by ex-NASA computer scientists. Using a Cray XMP supercomputer, the fastest machine in the world at the time, they rendered over 27 minutes of pure CGI. It wasn't just new, it was terrifyingly unproven. Every starfield, every spinning Gunstar, every explosion was digital. In 1984, audiences had never seen this. What looked like glossy graphics on screen was actually the first step toward the CGI revolutions of Jurassic Park and Toy Story. What audiences didn't know: the tech was so unstable, even one power outage could have killed the movie. The CGI cost more than the actors. In most films, stars eat the budget. Not here. Lance Guest, who played Alex Rogan, earned modest pay compared to the tech behind him. The Cray XMP supercomputer alone cost over $15 million to purchase, about $45 million in today's money, and renting digital production services cost nearly as much as the entire live-action shoot. The irony? While the cast performed in desert trailers and shoestring sets, the computer ate electricity and money by the barrel. Studio execs nearly pulled the plug, horrified by runaway costs for cartoonish graphics. Yet those same graphics became the film's defining legacy. The Last Starfighter wasn't just paying for actors, it was bankrolling the future of digital filmmaking. Every pixel was a gamble, and the studio had no guarantee audiences wouldn't laugh it off as video game fluff. 300 years of rendering time. Rendering CGI today takes hours. In 1984, it was geological time. The film required nearly 300 scenes of computer animation, each taking hours, sometimes days per frame. Digital Productions later admitted that, in human time, the Cray XMP spent the equivalent of 300 years of processing power to complete the film's effects. If a single crash corrupted files, weeks of work vanished. To save time, animators cut corners, reusing starfields, recycling ship rotations, and faking physics. What audiences saw as sleek battles was really a Frankenstein patchwork of digital math, yet no one noticed. For a generation raised on arcade cabinets, the look was mesmerizing. The kicker? By today's standards, your phone could render the entire movie in minutes. But in 1984, The Last Starfighter was pushing computing to its breaking point. A video game that never was. It wasn't just the movie. The Last Starfighter was designed to launch alongside a revolutionary arcade game. Atari commissioned a cabinet that replicated the film's Gunstar battles, complete with 3D vector graphics. The prototype stunned test audiences, but the cost of producing such advanced hardware was astronomical. Fearing financial disaster, Atari canceled the game just before release. Only a handful. Odd of prototypes survived, making them holy grails for collectors. The irony? The film's entire plot hinges on a video game as a recruitment tool, yet the real tie-in game was scrapped. Years later, fan programmers recreated it online, proving the dream wasn't dead. Not a single audience member in 1984 knew that they were watching the first movie that was supposed to come with a working arcade cabinet. The Gunstar was a CGI miracle. The Gunstar, the film's iconic starfighter, was the single most complex CGI model ever built at that time. With over 250,000 polygons, it made the Millennium Falcon look like a Lego block by comparison. But that complexity nearly killed the production. The Cray struggled to render its curves and lighting, often overheating during sequences. Animators had to invent new rendering tricks just to keep the Gunstar visible on screen, including simulated shadows and reflection cheats. What audiences didn't realize? Every smooth barrel roll was stitched together from countless broken attempts. The Gunstar wasn't just a spaceship, it was proof that computers could outdesign physical models. When critics later mocked its plastic sheen, they missed the point. The Gunstar was the digital ancestor of every CGI spacecraft to follow. Digital space, instead of models before the Last Starfighter. Filmmakers painstakingly built models and filmed them with motion control cameras, like in Star Wars. But Nick Castle made a radical decision: scrap miniatures entirely for the space battles. This horrified veteran effects artists, who warned the studio that audiences wouldn't buy cartoon ships. Yet Castle pushed forward, convinced computers could simulate perspectives impossible for cameras. The result? Ships swooping and rotating in ways no physical rig could achieve. What looked like a stylistic choice was actually necessity. Digital productions had no time to build physical models even if they wanted. Critics at the time were divided, some calling it video game fluff. But history proved Castle right. By eliminating models, The Last Starfighter set the stage for Tron, The Abyss, and eventually The Phantom Menace. It wasn't a compromise. It was evolution. The arcade cabinet was real. The heart of the movie is Alex Rogan beating an arcade game that secretly recruits him into interstellar war. But here's the twist. The cabinet was real. Production designers built a fully working arcade machine with flashing lights, sound effects, and playable screens, even though it only ran a looping animation. Actors didn't just mime joystick moves, they played. Locals in the trailer park set begged to try the game between takes, not realizing it was just smoke and mirrors. When the prop was auctioned years later, it became one of the most sought-after pieces of arcade memorabilia, despite not running any actual gameplay. What audiences didn't know: that fake arcade cabinet had more cultural staying power than dozens of real Atari titles released the same year. The cast didn't trust the tech. For actors like Lance Guest and Catherine Mary Stewart, filming without physical ships, starfields, or explosions was maddening. Instead of reacting to models or explosions, they stared at blank screens and glowing markers, told, "Imagine the ship there." Guest later admitted he thought the movie looked cheap during filming. Stewart confessed she feared the film would never be finished. Even extras muttered about cartoons replacing real sets. Not X-Wings, not matte paintings, just blue screens and placeholders. It wasn't until they saw the completed film at premiere that they realized they'd witnessed history. Their skepticism mirrored Hollywood's many critics dismissed CGI as a gimmick, but within a decade, every studio was chasing what The Last Starfighter pioneered. What once looked laughable became the industry standard. The Cray nearly fried the studio digital productions. Cray XMP didn't just render the film, it nearly burned it down. The machine required liquid cooling and drew so much power that it risked blackouts. Engineers joked that every render sequence was like flying too close to the sundae. On one occasion, a coolant failure almost fried weeks of work. The crew scrambled with makeshift fixes, hoses, fans, even ice, just to keep frames processing. Studio execs panicked at the idea that millions could vanish in a puff of smoke. What audiences didn't see was that behind every glossy CGI battle was a supercomputer wheezing like a dying starship. The Cray was both miracle and monster. Without it, the movie wouldn't exist. But with it, the studio was constantly one error away from disaster. Critics called it a video game movie. When the film premiered in 1984, some critics dismissed it as a glorified video game at a time when the gaming industry was in crisis after Atari's crash. What they didn't realize was how intentional that connection was. Screenwriter Jonathan Betuel had envisioned the story as the sword in the stone for the arcade generation. The video game aesthetic wasn't an accident, it was the point. But early reviews sneered at the graphics, missing the groundbreaking vision. Ironically, decades later, the very thing mocked became its legacy. Gamers adopted it as a cult classic, and filmmakers cited it as inspiration for Ready Player One. Here's the kicker. What critics derided as cheap in 1984 is now celebrated as pioneering. And before we blast forward into Fact Hashin' 1, go ahead and like and subscribe, because the next 10 facts only get weirder, wilder, and more shocking than anything you've seen so far. The villain's prosthetics were brutal. The Kodan Emperor's grotesque look wasn't CGI, it was old-school prosthetics. Actor K.E. Cooter sat through hours of makeup, layered with latex appliances that restricted breathing and vision. Under hot lights, the rubber trapped sweat, and Cooter could barely see the camera. At one point, the adhesive melted, and makeup artists had to peel and reapply his face mid-shoot. Unlike the digital battles, this was pure physical endurance. The irony? While audiences marveled at computer effects, the most grueling parts for actors were still flesh and blood suffering. What audiences didn't know, the Emperor's sneer was partly real pain. Every line delivered through suffocating prosthetics added a raw intensity that no CGI could fake. The clash between digital ships and human endurance gave the film its strange hybrid energy, a script that no one believed. In Jonathan Betuel's screenplay faced rejection after rejection, studios scoffed at the idea of a boy recruited by a video game. "It's too silly," one executive allegedly said. Others dismissed it as Star Wars light. Betuel nearly gave up until Lorimar, a television studio branching into film, took a chance. Ironically, Lorimar had no experience with cutting-edge VFX, meaning the production became a gamble of outsiders against Hollywood veterans. What audiences didn't know, The Last Starfighter existed only because bigger studios passed. Those rejections preserved its oddball charm. Instead of polished blockbuster polish, it felt like a scrappy underdog story both on screen and behind the scenes. The parallels were uncanny. Alex Rogan, dismissed by everyone, saves the galaxy. Betuel, dismissed by execs, made cinematic history. Lance Guest's double duty. Lance Guest didn't just play Alex Rogan, the Trailer Park Dreamer. He also played Beta, his robotic double. Filming Beta was chaos. Guest spent hours under sticky prosthetics, mechanical rigs, and partial animatronics that made him look half-built. The Beta effects malfunctioned constantly at one point. His rubber skin bubbled and peeled mid-scene, causing the crew to break into laughter. Guest later confessed he hated playing Beta, calling the prosthetics claustrophobic and stifling. Yet those moments added a creepy surrealism audiences still remember. Not Alex, not just Lance, but Lance twice, sweating under the weight of faulty robotics. What audiences didn't know was that the humor of Beta's malfunctions wasn't entirely scripted. Some of it was pure accident captured on film, and that accidental weirdness became unforgettable. The desert shoot was miserable. While CGI ate the budget, the human cast sweated it out in New Mexico's blazing Sunday. The trailer park scenes were filmed in scorching heat, with cast and crew hiding under umbrellas between takes. Locals wandered onto set, curious about the fake arcade cabinet. Even worse, dust storms ruined takes, coating cameras and equipment in grit. Catherine Mary Stewart remembered constant dehydration and headaches. Meanwhile, the visual effects team worked in freezing computer labs hundreds of miles away. The irony was striking. On one side, actors fighting heat and exhaustion. On the other, machines battling overheating circuits. What audiences didn't know, the small town looked idyllic on screen but was hell to shoot. The sweat dripping down Alex Rogan's forehead wasn't always acting, it was survival in the desert. An alternate ending was planned originally. The Last Starfighter was going to end on a darker note. Early drafts had Alex returning to Earth only to discover the trailer park destroyed in a Kodan reprisal, forcing him to accept permanent exile. But test audiences found it too grim, so the studio demanded a hopeful resolution. Instead, Alex reunites with Maggie, ready to build a new life among the stars. What audiences didn't know, buried under that happy ending, is the ghost of a bleaker finale. Jonathan Betuel later admitted he wanted to explore the toll of leaving Earth behind, but the studio feared depressing audiences already skeptical of CGI. The alternate ending may never have been filmed, but its shadow lingers. Alex's triumph was nearly tragedy. The sound design was a battlefield. The CGI may have dazzled, but without powerful sound, it would have fallen flat. Composer Craig Safan had to score action that barely existed during production. He wrote music before the effects were rendered, using storyboards and rough animatics. Meanwhile, the sound team created laser blasts and explosions by layering recordings of fireworks, gunshots, and even slammed car doors. The Gunstar's engine roar, a heavily modified jet recording, slowed down until it sounded alien. But the real battle came in mixing. CGI battles had no natural sound, so everything had to be invented from scratch. What audiences didn't know was that every swoop and blast was a wild experiment. Without that sonic landscape, the CGI might have felt hollow. Instead, it thundered with life. A sequel script existed for decades. Almost immediately after release, Universal toyed with a sequel. Jonathan Betuel wrote a draft titled Starfighter, The Next Generation, following Alex's son recruited years later, but studio politics and changing technology shelved it. Rumors swirled for decades, with fans begging for revival. In the 2000 seconds, Betuel confirmed he was still developing it, but legal battles over rights kept it in limbo. Even Steven Spielberg's Amblin reportedly showed interest at one point. What audiences didn't know, the sequel was trapped in development hell, caught between nostalgia and ownership disputes. Only in the streaming era did serious talks resurface, with whispers of modern CGI rebooting the Gunstar for new audiences. The irony? A movie about bold leaps in technology was held hostage by old-school contracts. The Gunstar's interior was a tiny set. On screen, the Gunstar cockpit looked sprawling, filled with glowing consoles and sweeping windows. In reality, it was a cramped plywood set barely big enough for 2 actors. To fake the illusion of depth, designers angled panels and used forced perspective. Catherine Mary Stewart later joked that she and Lance Guest were practically sitting in each other's laps during cockpit scenes. Sweating under lights, they often banged elbows against the walls mid-take. What audiences didn't know, the sleek Starfighter interior was more claustrophobic than heroic. The irony, while CGI made space infinite, the human actors performed in a shoebox. That tension, Vast digital battles framed against cramped, sweaty sets gave the film a strange duality between grandeur and intimacy. Universal didn't market it properly. Despite its groundbreaking visuals, Universal treated The Last Starfighter like a small release. Marketing was minimal, with posters emphasizing the arcade cabinet more than the sci-fi epic. It premiered the same summer as Ghostbusters and Gremlins, burying it under blockbusters. Box office numbers were modest, disappointing execs. What audiences didn't know? Poor marketing nearly erased the film from history. Only VHS rentals and cable airings kept it alive, where kids stumbled across it and spread word of mouth. Decades later, cult status elevated it into legend. Ironically, the same executives who doubted CGI were proven wrong by the film's long-term staying power. Not a flop, not forgotten. A sleeper hit reborn in living rooms, one tape at a time. It inspired future innovators. Though not a box office smash, The Last Starfighter left fingerprints on Hollywood's future. Pixar's Ed Catmull and John Lasseter cited it as a proof of concept for fully digital storytelling. James Cameron studied digital production's work before tackling the abyss. Even George Lucas, initially skeptical, took notes for pre-visualization in the Star Wars prequels. What audiences didn't know, every digital blockbuster owes a debt to this film. Without it, studios may have delayed CGI for years. The Last Starfighter wasn't just entertainment, it was a blueprint. What looked like a cult sci-fi about a kid from a trailer park was actually Hollywood's roadmap for the future. It wasn't just pixels, it was prophecy. The Cray supercomputer moonlighted for the military. Here's the twist no one saw coming. The Cray XMP used to render The Last Starfighter didn't just serve Hollywood. Between render jobs, the same machine was reportedly rented out for defense simulations, nuclear modeling, missile trajectories, and Cold War calculations. That means the same circuits that birthed the Gunstar's barrel rolls also calculated real-world war scenarios. What audiences didn't know? The line between sci-fi, fantasy, and military reality blurred in one machine. A children's film about arcade games and aliens was powered by the same tech, fueling the nuclear arms race. The Gunstar wasn't just fighting the Kodan Armada, it was a ghost of the Cold War. Closing reflection. The Last Starfighter may have looked like a quirky sci-fi flick in 1984, but behind the screen, it was a crucible of risk, pain, and invention. Actors doubted, critics mocked, studios panicked, but history vindicated it. The film dared to replace models with math, sweat with silicon, and disbelief with dreams. Its legacy? Proof that the future of cinema would be digital. If you loved uncovering these hidden secrets, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment with your favorite behind-the-scenes fact. And remember, sometimes the smallest films launch the biggest revolutions. Victory or death. Starfighter.